A few years ago, I wrote a blog post which was meant to bring some controversy about an issue that now is largely discussed, which is digital diplomacy. How politicians, how people in policymaking use social media and online platforms to influence policy and diplomacy at large. What I'm trying to do today is to connect with the greatest expert on this topic, which is definitely Andreas Sandre. Andrea is the author of Twitter for Diplomats which was published in 2013, and of Digital Diplomacy: Conversations on Innovation in Foreign Policy. I'm connecting if technically this will be possible. The image looks clear. I'm very confident it's gonna work. Andreas is in Washington, D.C., so it's the first time I do a transatlantic Facebook Live interview.
Well, hopefully it works this time.
I'm sure it will. And actually, yeah, I just read the latest Gary Vaynerchuk book that says stop creating, start documenting, including technical failures. So I think that Gary V would be very proud of me. Andreas, so you're probably the biggest expert on this very specific topic that started out a few years ago. Nobody in the policy sphere, apart from a few real communication experts, could see where this was going. But now every politician, almost every ministry, every state department, every country pretty much is on a number of social platforms. It's not just about Twitter as it was back in 2010. It's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's LinkedIn. Some politicians use heavily Snapchat. Where is digital diplomacy today? How can we define it? What it is today?
So again, it's important for me to start with my definition of digital diplomacy because there are so many out there. On one side, of course, is how Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the foreign relations and international relations community use social media to communicate with audiences and to broadcast their messages and sort of like create some kind of engagement with audiences out there. But on the other side, for me, is also a way to empower technology so that government really understand how technology in the digital age are changing the way we interact with each other, whether it's services for citizens or better understanding the world or retuning our foreign policy priorities, or if you're a politician at the end of the day, reach out to communities out there so that they better understand you and you better understand them. That sort of like two ways has to work for both the government side and the citizen side, but also the business side. So social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others are platforms, and governments use them for free, but we need to understand them, the impact that they have in society. The fake news phenomenon is kind of important for everybody to understand exactly how it's changing the way we look at the news and we look at facts and sort of like what happens around the world. So at the end of the day, it's diplomacy. So diplomacy is relations between government and how government sort of like form some kind of relationship with citizens around the world to explain why we have an embassy, for instance, why we have consulates, what they do, why we're out there in the world trying to, if it's a multilateral sort of organization at the United Nations, or it's a bilateral relations like Italy and the US, why we're doing this and what are our main goals.
How important it is today to display publicly on social media relations that countries might have with each other? There are some examples of a number of embassies who are pretty, I want to say aggressive, but it can be passive aggressive towards others. Like how important it is for the branding of a country to publicly display their diplomacy online.
Well, it's important because we need to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and sort of like in a way also understand the other side and better retune our foreign policy priorities. We need to tell people why we have a foreign policy, but not just like our foreign audiences, but also our citizens at home, so they understand where their taxpayer money is going and why we're spending it around the world. So in a way, digital diplomacy is part of a larger public diplomacy sort of strategy for any country, where the community, it's part of our how a foreign ministry communicate, how ambassadors communicate to their audiences. But it's also a way to sort of like form a foreign policy for our own country, understanding what others are doing, and as if you look at public diplomacy, the big picture is that some countries are more sort of like engaged in public diplomacy than others. Some are spending more money and investing a bigger budget than other countries, whether it's like a country or an international or regional organizations like the EU, for instance.
Do you think so? I mean, you must have looked at a lot of accounts, how they interact, how they work. I want to know from you, do you see a significant difference in communicating by institutions, so let's say even ministries or international organizations, when the government or when the governing actor of the institution changes? Like, do you think there is still some kind of desire to keep it neutral as much as possible, regardless who takes office? Or now more and more there is a trend to reflect on actually who is governing that institution?
Well, if you look at how government works and how politics works, ministries are sort of like dependent on whoever is in power, whoever is governing that specific country, or whoever is sort of managing that specific institution. So oftentimes their accounts, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, or other social media platforms, reflect on what the policies are in a more neutral way, maybe, than a more political way, but they still reflect what the main policies are. It's important oftentimes to see how different accounts sort of like react on the news of the day, or whatever the priorities are. So oftentimes you have not just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or an embassy, but you also have the minister himself or herself on a specific social media platform, oftentimes Twitter, because it seems like the most popular for politicians and ministers, but also ambassadors, for instance. So it gives like a more personal sort of touch to the public diplomacy communication of an embassy or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or even a politician, where it's oftentimes you have like the official page, but also like a more personal way.
I don't know whether you agree or not, but if we look at your work and at the work of others that have worked in this field, we can see that the United States were far ahead in terms of using social media for politics. I say I don't want to say digital diplomacy. I think a few people in Northern Europe were very far ahead as well. But in terms of using social media for politics, the US were very much ahead. I think that Obama opened a Facebook page in 2007. At the time, we were still wondering whether profiles were pages, and it was unclear how Facebook really worked in Europe. So why do you think there is this, if you think that that's the case, why do you think there is such a big gap between the US and the old continent when it comes to innovating communications in politics?
Well, certainly money is a role. I mean, if you look at U.S. politics, if you look at U.S. politics and the million of dollars that usually move around any political election here in the United States, that's it's important to look how that money was sort of used, or is used in election campaigns. And at some point, politicians, even before Obama, sort of started to look how digital platforms, even before Facebook, and at some point even Friendster and MySpace, were used to sort of like.
Well, that seems so old today. That seems so old.
I know, but I mean, those were platforms that were used before, even in political campaigns here in the United States. So money is certainly one one factor. If you look at public diplomacy and digital diplomacy, though, the role of digital diplomacy is sort of different from the role of social media in politics and elections, because at the end of the day, a politician is looking for votes. So there's also a lot of money that you can spend in amplifying your message with ads, for instance. And even though ads now in platforms like Twitter and Facebook are sort of changing and getting a little bit better at transparency, in digital diplomacy, we're not looking for votes. We're just looking for communicating our foreign policy priorities and understand how we can sort of like create some sort of engagement with our audiences. And even there, if I look at my country, Italy, or many European countries, and even the European Union, one of the goals is sort of communicating with people at home. So if you look at the European Commission, one of the goals of even the External Action Service, they're sort of like the Foreign Ministry of the European Union, is to talk to European citizens and tell them why there's an External Action Service and what that does. The same for Italy and other European countries. One of the goals is to communicate with people at home in terms of better understanding why there's a foreign ministry and what embassies around the world do. If you look at the United States, their strategy is different, also because of legal constraints that they have. The State Department, for instance, and their public diplomacy program cannot target people at home. They can only target people in foreign countries, so only foreign audiences, even though in the digital age that's kind of difficult, because when you put a message out there, that message goes anywhere. It doesn't matter if you target that message specifically to a foreign audience and try not to target audiences at home.
Spacing away from the usual transatlantic debate, we always think we are the best at everything. But I think that there are some impressive case studies that come from Central and South America, with presidents that have millions and millions of followers, and they use social media extensively and successfully. But I think what is really fascinating for us from our Western eyes is to look at Asia. In countries like China, where Facebook and Instagram have some significant limitations, and we're talking about a population of 1.4 billion people. How are things, if you have looked at them, how are things in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, which is the fastest growing levels of penetration of the internet over the past 5 years? It has been recorded in the Gulf and in Southeast Asia. Do you have any thoughts on how things work over there?
Well, I'm not an expert on the APAC region, but if you look at the sheer number of people that are in that sort of market, it's sort of like extraordinary to see how, for instance, in Malaysia and Indonesia, platforms like Twitter is very, very popular with politicians, and they're using it in the best possible way. But it's also like connected to the number of people and the internet penetration, and sort of like the Twitter penetration that those tools have. If you look at China, for any diplomat, it would be important to look at other platforms, just because Facebook and Twitter don't have any reach out there. So Weibo has become like an important tool for any sort of embassies and ambassadors and foreign ministry to sort of use to at least explore some sort of engagement with the local population. And if you look at Russia, even maybe Twitter is a popular tool for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to outreach to their foreign audiences. But if you're posted in Russia, Twitter might not be the best tool.
Okay. Apart from the use of governments in communicating to the public and in pursuing public diplomacy with other countries and other actors in the decision-making process, digital diplomacy has been used in reverse. For instance, I'm thinking about the Green Revolution in Iran, or I'm thinking about the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I'm thinking about Taksim Square, so in all these occasions, everybody, so Maidan, Tehran, and Taksim, all these revolutions were coordinated on Twitter. And in a number of occasions, especially I'm thinking about Turkey, Twitter was shut down because of information that was considered to be problematic to be public for the government at the time. Now, when you think this realization that it's not just broadcasting, that it's a way that people can have the power to communicate also against possibly governments came about, what do you think are the events that can say in history, okay, this is the moment where the people realize social media empowered them and they showed it with these actions? Do you have anything in mind that could be worth mentioning?
Well, I think it's like when you see countries sort of shutting down their internet infrastructure and their so that they don't allow users or their citizens to connect on any of those platforms. That's when you realize the impact that those platforms might have or had in the past. And that's why I think it's important to look at digital diplomacy not just as a tool, not just as a way to communicate and let people communicate with you, but also as a way for governments to sort of like wake up and have a better relations with those technology companies that developed and sort of like manage those platforms. If you look at terrorism, for instance, Facebook and Twitter, but also the sort of like more sort of like apps that have messages that are not free and readable, like for instance like WhatsApp or Telegram. If you look at those platforms, those are a great way for terrorist groups, whether it's ISIS or others, to recruit and amplify their voices. So it's important to understand what role those platforms have, understand that those platforms are, at the end of the day, are companies, and the goal of those companies is to make money, to create profits for their investors, because most of the time they're public companies, Facebook and Twitter and Google. But it's also creating that sort of like link that government needs to better explore with those companies, because they're, at the end of the day, real actors in foreign policy. Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and I'm forgetting one, and Google created the Internet Global Forum last year to sort of better coordinate with governments and with themselves and create best practices to fight terrorism online. If you look at Facebook, for instance, a couple of years ago, they partnered with the State Department and a NGO here in Washington, D.C., Adventure Partners, to create a contest. It's called the P2P Global Challenge, where they ask university students around the world to create campaigns through Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter to amplify positive voices against terrorism or against hate. And every year I think it's like twice a year, they have the finals here in Washington, D.C., and you see how those students from everywhere around the world, like a couple of years ago, even like an Italian team, but Belgium, where terrorism is like a very big, important topic of discussion. Or if you look at Indonesia, if you look at Nigeria, many different teams, college teams from around the world participated and show how those platforms can really be used for campaigns that can be innovative and can really reach out to citizens out there, so that you on one side you amplify positive voices, and on the other side you sort of like counter propaganda and counter sort of like ISIS recruitment or terrorist recruitment online.
That's actually pretty fantastic to hear about this project and how college students are involved in such an important topic, because lately these companies have been under attack actually by governments and international organizations, especially when it comes to privacy. Where do you think this is going to go? Do you think that governments and public institutions somehow will come to some sort of, let's say, regularization of what they can do? Because basically these companies, let's say Facebook is based in Ireland and in Silicon Valley, but they are global companies that have global reach, that have a considerable power of action. And when it comes, for instance, to deciding about censorship, we have seen that they apply a standard that somehow tries to reflect the society where that censorship is applied. Now, where do you think this is going to go? Do you think, in your opinion, there's going to be more coming together or more setting apart between big tech communication companies and governments?
Well, I think like everybody agrees that there needs to be better regulation around social media platforms. Like the coming out and coming into force of the GDPR in Europe was sort of like a wake-up call for many governments and many regulators and legislators around the world to see like, well, I mean, the GDPR now has an impact not only within the borders of the European Union, but also outside the borders of the European Union. So how are, especially here in the United States, so how are regulators here in the US or around the world sort of like responding to, for instance, GDPR or the debate around regulations and privacy and security for those platforms? I think like the main concern is sort of like security and privacy of the users, and for the users to better understand what happens to their data and whatever they're doing on that platform, how much do those platforms collect, and are you really aware of how much those platforms collect? But I think that debate goes even before social media. If you look at if you look at here at the United States, most of the times when you go shop in any large sort of compartment store like Target or Walmart, oftentimes they call them the frequent flyer cards. It's like cards that you use at those stores for discounts. And even those cards, they're not, credit cards. They're just cards that you use for coupons and discounts. They collect data about users. So it's not just, and I remember like a couple of years ago, there was a story in the New York Times of a 16-year-old who received a coupon at home in the mail from Target, which is like a big department store here in the United States, for baby products. And the girl was 16. She was actually pregnant. The mom didn't know that she was pregnant, but Target knew just because the girl changed her habits, sort of shopping habits at Target. She wasn't buying anything specifically for babies, but she decided to buy vitamins or different kind of clothes, maybe a larger size than before. So Target sort of like, decided that because of all the data that they collected, the girl was pregnant. And in fact, the girl was pregnant. But again, that's not just a debate around technology. It's a debate around privacy and security. And maybe in Europe, we have a better understanding of those concepts. In other countries, the understanding of those concepts is a little bit different. So I think it's important to look at how broad the debate is, and how sort of technology has a role to play in sort of on one side self-regulating, and on the other side for regulators to better proceed with sort of like better legislation for the future.
Andreas, I have one last question for you. Earlier on, you talked about WhatsApp and Messenger, so direct messaging platforms. Funny enough, these two products are both part of Facebook. So Facebook owns these two products. I want to talk about this because it seems that the future of communication, of public communication in governments, in politics, will shift towards exclusive messaging, meaning that now we are getting saturated to get so many notifications on our phones that when we get a message which is exclusive to us, we will read it, but not necessarily we go through all the Facebook notifications that we get throughout the day. We're not going to look at everybody who's seen our Instagram stories. But if there is one message to us, we read it. It's like getting a text now in 2018. You will read that. So it's probably something, it's either somebody very old, in my experience, that doesn't use WhatsApp, or it's somebody from a company, but that is exclusive. And also WhatsApp has this element, apart from groups, of exclusivity. It's a message that I send to you, And now these platforms are equipping themselves with ways to allow this communication in a way that it looks like it's exclusive. I am a politician, and even though I can use bots, I am sending a message to you, to Marco, to Frank, to Stephanie, and so on, and it looks like it's exclusive to them. Do you think this prediction is correct? And how would you think this will affect public diplomacy?
Well, I think like if we look at how advertising works, we're always like interested in seeing how companies are customizing messages for their for people that shop at their stores or people that shop online. So you see like oftentimes them using emails to send you coupons or discount for products that you really want, and that also is sort of like provided to them from your activity on social media and on platforms like Google Search, for instance. So the interaction between sort of like the private apps and the sort of like more public apps is kind of important to look at how sort of like customization of communication works for different sort of like objectives and different goals. So that's probably one of the trends. But I think like those platforms that are public are still platforms that are going to be important for public diplomacy, more so maybe than WhatsApp, Messenger, and Telegram, where it requires more customization, ways to sort of like ministries of foreign affairs. At the end of the day, they're not companies. They don't have budgets similar to those of advertisers and companies. So it can be a little bit harder for them to use those platforms. On the other hand, although those platforms can be used to communicate with your citizens that are traveling abroad during natural disasters. And that's like a good way for government to explore platforms that can be really used in terms of emergency situations, like the recent earthquake in, I think it was Indonesia. So I think it's like important to look at the different goals that you have as government and, agencies that are part of the government, and sort of like trying to better understand and navigate and explore those platforms. I think it's like exploring and sort of like trying to innovate and try to create best practices is very important, because everybody else can look at what you're doing and everybody else can implement those strategies and those best practices in their own communication strategy.
Andreas, thank you so much for being with us today. All information about your work will be published in the description of this live, and I will invite people to get in touch with you, because you responded like so eloquently to all my questions without, with no hesitation. And thank you so much for providing your knowledge, and keep up the good work. Do you have any book coming up? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, it's I'm trying to sort of, I don't consider myself an expert. I sort of consider myself as an explorer. So I'm trying to better understand and put in a book how technology is changing everything in our lives. And I've been interviewing and talking to startup founders and CEOs and people involved in different organizations like Wikimedia and Code for America, and ask them like, what do they think, and what do they think the future from in 5, 10, and 50 years is, and what do they think it's important to look at in terms of how technology is evolving, whether it's like platforms, social media platforms, whether it's blockchain or any other technology out there like artificial intelligence, virtual reality. So hopefully by the end of the year, I have something a little bit more concrete, and something next year I'll be able to publish. So.
That sounds like a lot of work. Good luck with that. We can do another interview when it comes out. Thank you so much. Say hi to lovely Washington, D.C. for me, and stay tuned for more.
And again, for everybody, thank you. For everybody, actually, they can contact me on Facebook and also on Twitter. My DM is always open. So I'm always interested in what people had to ask, or if they have like anything that they want to share. Always happy to do that.
Andreas, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.